I do not like snakes in any way. And we were getting ready to head out on our last tour, and I had the bus. We travel in a bus conversion. And I had the bus backed up to the back door so I could just walk out and carry stuff into the bus. And the morning before we left, I kind of looked down at behind the back side of the bus, and there was a big puddle of water, and I wondered, is this antifreeze, or is it just condensation off of the the roof of the bus? So I got down on my knees and looked under the bus, and I put my hand out here like this to support myself. And just as I put my hand out here, from about here to here was a rattlesnake. It's a baby. It had shed its skin once, so it had one little tiny rattle, size of a pinhead maybe on its tail. And I got up. I mean, my adrenaline hit. I have a fear of snakes. The thalamus received the stimulus, and the amygdala triggered a fast physical reaction because it registers danger. And I was up on my feet in a millisecond. And my heart is racing. And my blood pressure is up. And I am ready to run out in the street. So that's what the amygdala does. Now, the thalamus in registering danger. What we don't realize many times is the thalamus and the brain receives everything from the five senses. It receives everything, and we forget it consciously, but the thalamus registers it permanently. So everything that leads up to the wound, everything that happens after the wound is registered to the wound. We work with women who've been battered. That woman can know 6 months ahead of time she's going to be battered again, because the thalamus registers the pattern and the profile of the pre-existing behavior before she gets smacked. So she doesn't know she senses it, but he drives in the driveway 3 months before she knows she's going to get hit, and butterflies stir in her stomach. And she's saying to the kids, put your toys away, and, Daddy's coming home. Put your toys away, clean up your room, and kind of be silent and stay in there for a little bit till Daddy comes home. Because she knows ahead of time. So the thalamus retains and puts into the memory bank everything that leads up to this wound. It could be the weather. It could be a smell. It could be the sun shining in a certain way. It could be a place. It could be a word. It could be a feeling. See, and all of this registers so that the thalamus is going to cause you to react before you're wounded again. See, that's what a trigger is. And what happens with a wounded memory is a normal memory is called a narrative memory. And the narrative memory is like you're driving down the street and something triggers you to think about a birthday party when you were 12 years old. And you'll start thinking about that, and then something else triggers, and there's a 60 Thunderbird sitting alongside the road. And I had one of those when I was a young man, and boy, you're sure like those cars, like to have another one of those. And I'm thinking about that, and something else triggers, and our mind just kind of lopes along with narrative memory. And we can stop the narrative memory and move on to something else. But with an intrusive memory, there's something that triggers that intrusive memory, and that intrusive memory, which is stored on the right side of the brain, which normal narrative memory is stored on the left side of the brain. The right side is the most sensitive side of the brain, and that intrusive memory stores on the right side with all of the memory intact, all of the emotions of the wound intact, all of the reactive behavior intact, all of the smells intact, all of the color intact. And yet what happens so many times is we have been hurt so deeply that the memory has been capped off and we don't remember it, but all of the emotion tied to it comes out. And we wonder, am I nuts? I don't even know this. I'll tell people sometimes, you must have had a horrendous area in childhood. Oh no, my childhood was perfect. But you say something else, and man, they're on the ceiling. They just escalate instantaneously. In a millisecond, they've escalated. So the memory is gone. It's capped off. And see, when we don't deal with the issues of childhood, then what happens is the subconscious or the thalamus gets the message this cannot be dealt with, and if I keep trying to get it dealt with, then this person is going to commit suicide or go into depression. So again, memory loss and denial is God's gift to keep us alive until someone comes into our life to make sense of the craziness. But what happens if I don't have a memory, but I'm extremely reactive, then what do I say? I must be crazy. And we cause a lot of craziness, and we think, boy, I'm really defective because there's no reason I should act like that, but I'm driven. See, so the thalamus records all of these things, and then way up front, before the woundedness happens, whatever looks like it looked like when you were hurt as a child, the thalamus then, a nanosecond, causes us to be reactive, and that's called triggering. And when that intrusive memory of the wound comes to surface, or the reaction comes to surface, you cannot stop it. See, that's why we have to look at our triggers, because once it starts to escalate, there's no way it's going to play itself out in living color. It's going to play itself out, and you're going to go irrational. You're going to say things and do things you'd never say, because what's happened is that woundedness stopped the development. You are not a decision maker. You can't bring down the strongholds. You can't bring captive the imaginations. And this is an imagination that has not come captive. It's an imagination. It's a memory. It's a reactive behavior that comes to surface, and there's nothing you can do about it once it comes to surface. It's going to play its way out until you burn off all the adrenaline. That's tied to that memory trigger. And so we can literally be walking along smoothly together. And I can say something, or Judy can say something, and I'll trigger, and if I didn't bring that imagination and understand my triggers, I could carry it on and just beat a dead horse to death with that very same thing. And I've done it in the past. And that's where I said, God, what do I have to do to understand this dynamic so I don't put myself in these kind of positions to where I'm going to trigger? And how do I deal with my own trigger? How do I delay my responses? And that's when we're going next, because, excuse me, when I saw the snake, I was up. I mean, I didn't have to think, I better get out of here. I was up. I was standing up. I was shaking. My back hurt because the adrenaline glands had kicked in the adrenaline. My heart rate was up. And I've had heart problems, so I started to get angina pains. I mean, I was wired with that snake. So what we're going to do is we go to the next slide. I want to help us take a look at this. Is kind of a close-up of the brain. The brain has 260 billion cell structures. And they all work together in a magnificent way. The more I study this area of the brain and neuroscience, the more I know there is a God. This cannot be random chance. There is a God. So that's kind of what the brain looks like. And as we go to the next slide, I want to isolate some things here. What we're looking at is a neuron, which is a nerve cell. And that's right there in the center. That's a neuron. Then we look at the nucleus, and the nucleus is inside of this. And in the nucleus, there's a tremendous amount of activity going on. The synapses in there, the chemical structure, the electrochemical structure that's going on. It's just phenomenal. And when you get into the studying in the miniaturization of this, it just is mind-boggling how we've been created. It's so wonderful. Then we see over here is the axon, and the axon is the outgoing if you have a telephone, your dendrites are the incoming message, and the axon is the outgoing message. Now, let's look at this little, and I'm not going to be real technical, this little wiener substance around the axon. is called a myelin sheath. And the myelin sheath attaches itself to the axons which drive our behaviors. They're called habits. So if I react in anger, I build, because of the electrical impulses going through this, the electrical impulses constantly in the way I think and the way I react and the way I respond. I'm constantly using this area here, and so with such great use, this becomes automatic pilot. I just react. It's there. And it builds the myelin sheath so that it protects my survival systems and my habits. And that's why habits are so hard to break. You cannot stop a habit, you have to replace it with something else. Always. Now, I want to do an animation on the neurobiology of salvation, of accepting Christ. And I think that's probably going to be one of the greatest witnessing tools a person could ever have, is to understand that when I accept Christ, it's not just an emotional, spiritual, etherical experience. I'm literally rewiring the brain. Here's what happens. I make a decision, and the greatest power, I insert this, the greatest power on the face of this planet is your will. When I chose change, and I'm going to show you with an illustration, when I chose to change, and I was facing 15 to 22 in the state pen for attempted murder, that's pretty serious. That did get my attention. When I chose to change, I didn't realize that my change and my choice was causing my brain to rewire. When I accept Christ, or I say, I make up my mind unto death, I'm going to change a habit, what happens is a new neuronal structure starts sprouting out of this nucleus and may run parallel to a habit. So if this is my anger and rage axon, and I then accept Christ, and I am now going to develop the fruit of the Spirit, patience, long-suffering, and all those kind of things. That's kind of the opposite of anger, wouldn't you say? See? So out of this, I sprout a new neuronal structure, communicator, and it will come out like this. These are new dendrites and axons that are hooking somewhere down the road as I choose to do what I've chosen to do. So I will have one come out, and it will start to route maybe parallel to the one that has the myelin sheath. Now, what's interesting with this is the myelin sheath, made up of fatty tissue, will have a tendency to arch its back, and I'm using layman's terms, to reach up and devour the new neuronal structure. So this is growing along parallel, and the myelin sheath, and this is all scripturally sin nature, protecting itself. The myelin sheath will arch up and try to grab this new communicator, this new neuronal structure, and eat it. And that's why we have many false starts in Christianity, because people don't understand what they're dealing with. So as we quit venting our anger and using this one, and we focus on using the new one grows very quickly because of our will. And when we start to use the new one consistently, the electrical impulses are then not going here, they're going here to the new one. So the electrical impulses actually are locked up here, and what happens is the old structure atrophies for lack of use. And that's the death of the old man in the scriptures. Isn't that interesting? The old dies. Even with the myelin sheath protecting it, the old will disintegrate and wash away in the bloodstream, and it'll be eliminated. And the thing that we have to understand is the new will connect to another neuronal structure and then reconnect, and one new neuronal structure becomes two. 2 become 4, 4 become 8, 8 becomes 16, 16 become 32, 32 becomes 64, and we multiply, and it takes 3 years for the neuronal structure of the brain to wire to our new choice. And this is the thing that gripes me about many of the people in the body of Christ. We don't walk with our baby Christians long enough. And Paul says to move from milk to meat. And you mothers know that from birth milk to meat, the molars start growing in. They can grind meat and chew at about 3 years of age. Otherwise, terrible twos, you're cutting up little pieces of meat and they're chawing on it. But when the scripture says move from milk to meat, it's a 3-year period. That's why Jesus spent 3 years with the disciples. That's why Paul the Apostle had the Damascus Road experience and yet studied for 3 years before he opened his ministry. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, even the pagans knew this because they're hauled off into Babylon. And they studied for 3 years under the greatest pagan minds that Babylon had to offer. Now, let me throw another piece in here. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were raised in godly homes. Their lives were balanced, and they were trained. They were trained godly. And even though they spent 3 years in study under the pagan systems, when they were told you bow to an idol or you die, the training they got from birth to 13 was stronger than anything they learned in Babylon. And they said, our God will save us, and if he doesn't, that's okay. Now, let me reverse that. If you've been raised in a dysfunctional wounded home and wounded in childhood for your first 13 years, you're willing to die to the loyalty of your first 13 years. And the only reason you'll ever make a change in this 3-year period is because this is God's program. That's how God developed us in the brain. And if we have a stable foundation, the world can't shake us. If we have a bad foundation, a woundedness in childhood, we'll be loyal to and we'll literally go through a divorce and orphan our own children to be loyal to the first 13 years of our life. Judy tried to make, for our first marriage, 16 and a half years, she tried to mold me into a Ben Moser, her father. I tried to mold her into a Charlotte Hegstrom, my mother. And we divorced and wounded our children and each other desperately and lost all care for each other because we were more loyal to the family of origin than we were loyal to developing the family that God had placed us together with our children. But in God's principles, when we understand that we can change, we can break the cycle of our first 13 years and grow and mature, but it's going to be a 3-year process, and you can count on it. Because it takes 3 years for the brain to rewire. So people that are watching this tape and people here that are going back into their daily lives, this is process. There is no instantaneous change. Yes, the core is changed. I accept Christ. He forgives me, sets me anew, but my process I call sanctification. The world calls it recovery without Christ. I call it sanctification with him. Starts that process where we start to rewire. And because we stick like a bulldog to a shoe, where you grab that shoe back from that bulldog and you'll rip his teeth out, you can pick him up by the shoe and he'll hang there. That's how we need to deal with change. That we're literally, you're going to rip my teeth out to get me to, it's going to take that. You're going to have to hurt me bad for me to recant on what I've started in this ability to change. Because we're not just changing emotional stuff, we're literally rewiring the brain. And the scripture tells us that wide is the path to destruction, and narrow is the path to salvation, and few find it therein. Why? Because of the sin nature. Every child born until the point they accept Christ, every neuron is wired to destruction. Every neuron of the brain is wired to the sin nature. And narrow is the path, because it starts with one new pathway. And one become two, and two become four. And it's called the renewal of the mind in the Scripture on a daily basis. So change is not just emotional. Change is part of the neurobiology of what God has prepared us, so that change becomes permanent. Let me give you an example of that change. When Judy and I had hit the 11 years of marriage, 10 years ago, boy, time flies, James Kennedy at Coral Ridge, and most of you know who he is, sent a crew to do a documentary on us and our recovery. And we have that documentary. He preached a Sunday morning service around, or sermon on television around that documentary. And at the end of the documentary, they wanted to get some shots for B-roll, and what they wanted me to do was act like I'm smacking Judy and recreating abuse. And as they lined us up and says, now take her by the shoulders and shake her, and then act like you're cuffing her, don't hurt her, but just act like you're slapping her around, and so we can have some B-roll shots. And I took her by the shoulders, and all of a sudden everything in me went to water. I ended up with diarrhea and throwing up, and I ended up in the bathroom for about a half hour. And I came back up, and the producer says, what kind of wimp are you? You can't even do such and such. And I said, you know, this is probably one of the greatest days of my life. Because what I realized is I had pledged unto death, I will never hit again. I will never be emotionally abusive again to any woman, let alone my own wife. And when you ask me to do what you ask me to do, knowing that it's strictly for B-roll, it's strictly just acting out so you can have some footage, my brain could not tell the difference between B-roll and reality. And I have so trained my brain and so wired myself that my body would not let me touch her inappropriately. Isn't that something? My body would not let me do what was just going to be a B-roll example of the past. And so we ended up, if any of you saw the documentary, I was over here and Judy was over there, and they put lights behind us, and we did a little shadow boxing on the wall. And that's the only thing we could do. And to watch that, to visually see, like we're slapping each other around, and I'm hitting her, to see that made me even sicker. Because, see, the thalamus does not have eyes of its own. It does not have ears of its own. It uses the senses of our conscious person, the way we're created, to tell us truth. And the thalamus is going to record fantasy as truth. That's why children who are babysit by a TV set. That's why pornography is so hard to deal with. Because the subconscious mind can't tell the difference between pornography and a real woman. Especially if it's used in self-gratification. Because the picture, and I use the illustration when I talk about pornography, and this is appropriate here, is that if you've seen Toy Story and Bug's Life and all those, that animation is so perfect. It's not like Donald Duck and Mickey Mouse of our childhood, when I was a kid. This is so perfect and flows so smoothly. And that's all created by the mind of the person who created that software. So that tells us that the mind of a person is so magnificent that it can take a black and white picture of pornography, take one glance, lay it down, go into the theater of the mind and color and animate, and make that pornography, activate it, and make it do in the theater of my mind what nobody would ever ask a woman to do. And we think it's no consequences and it doesn't hurt anything because it's not real. But what we don't understand, and that's why the Scripture says, if you look upon a woman with lust, you've already done it in your heart. It's a done deal. It's going to be charged against you on Judgment Day. And the Scripture also says that we're going to be responsible not only for our words, our thoughts. But what happens is, as the mind is able to look at a black and white still picture, colorize it, animate it, and use it to our gratification, the subconscious mind cannot tell that that's a fantasy because the body responded to the picture in the mind. And that's what's so terrible with virtual reality and pornography and things on the computer. Because the mind, the way we're wired, sees it as reality. So we do rewire. And I was deeply into pornography and all of the major sins, and the minor ones too. But God has changed my mind, because just to grab Judy by the shoulders, my body responded, because I had wired myself to know this was wrong. I asked God one time when I first came back into a walk with Him through Christ, will I ever be normal with as deeply as I have gone into pornography and the sins of adultery and those kind of things? And it didn't take long. Within a year, God was able to make me normal in a marriage relationship. See, how? By the wiring of the brain. I rewired to the point that in a year I was functional and was stable. But in 3 years and more, my body would react negatively against something that I knew was wrong. See, so we can rewire, and it's not an emotional change. It's not just a spiritual change. It's not an etherical change. When we choose change, we are changing the brain. Now, let's go to the next slide. We think that when we have an event in our life, that it goes directly to reality. What I see is what is. Wrong. Everything that happens to us goes into the subconscious first and filters through the thalamus. Filters every input from our senses. What we see, feel, taste, touch, hear, experience is always colored by the previous input into the subconscious mind beginning in the womb. See how powerful that is? So we really don't see reality. We're seeing reality through my perceptions and my woundedness. And if we've had great joy, sometimes reality comes through the joy. But because we have tendencies, because of the sin nature, to go negative on everything, then we're seeing everything through the negative filtering system. So we don't just move from an event to reality. We move, the event happens and it goes into the subconscious and filters through, and then our reality is never reality if we've been wounded. It's only perception. The subconscious mind is fully developed at the 3rd trimester of pregnancy. If raised in a balanced environment with acceptance, security, happiness, and love, then we can accept the truth, accept pain, gather data, learn, our hearing develops, and we grow in a safe way. We're in a safe place. But if we're raised in an environment where there's rejection, shame, fear, anxiety, and helplessness, we cannot accept truth. We cannot trust. We can't accept pain as a learning tool. We have trouble learning. We even shut down in our senses, and especially the audio channel will shut down, because that's how we learn so much. One of the things I've studied over the years is number one, how does the brain work? How is it like a computer? And what are the stepping areas of how the brain receives, reacts? What do we need to come to wholeness? And that's what this program is all about. So looking at the brain as a computer, it's got everything in it that a normal computer would have. We gather the information from the environment, and what's interesting is we are literally computers without keyboards. We are voice activated. I have a computer upstairs that I can put on a set of headphones and a microphone, and I can pace the floor and write a book. And everything I say, once it recognizes my voice and we go through that routine, it will type as I talk. We are computers without keyboards. We are computers that are voice activated. We are sight activated. We are smell activated, taste activated, and touch activated. That's the senses. So we don't need a keyboard. So we gather the information from the environment through our transmitting station, and it goes into the hard drive, and here's how it goes in. And this is really important to understand. Before the computer receives, it perceives. So if we've been wounded, we don't have a clue what reality is. The deeper our wounds, the greater our perception, and perceptions are always warped, which means we don't see reality. We only see perception. And that's before the computer ever receives it. That's what's interesting. Everything is perception. See, give you an example. Deep wound, on a scale of 1 to 10 in depth of wound, and a scale of 1 to 10 in needs, if I'm wounded to a 9, my needs that I will suck out of other people will be expectations to a 9, of which nobody could ever achieve. When we talk about anger, anger is activated by an unmet expectation. So if I have been so deeply wounded that I expect everyone should meet this standard to validate me, in other words, I need this much to bring me up to here. So I'm always sucking energy from everybody, and I'm living in anger because nobody can meet that need, then my perceptions are keeping me in anger 24 hours a day. The higher my expectations, the greater my triggers. The higher my expectations, the greater my triggers. And this is all happening before the computer receives the experience. So what's going into the computer is not reality, it's perception colored by my woundedness in childhood. That's sick, isn't it? So our goal in our walk with the Lord is to get rid of the perceptions and see reality as He sees it. And the more we heal, the less perceptions we deal with, and the more reality we deal with. So our goal in our walk with Christ is to get rid of the perceptions and to start to see reality more and more and more. So the more we mature, the more we'll see reality, the more childish we stay, the more perceptions and expectations we have, which means we live in a lightning area of being triggered by almost anything, but it all goes back to childhood. It's not the reality of the day. So then what happens is our perception comes into the hard drive and receives it as reality. So our reality is way off. Then it sorts all of our experiences and analyzes and compares. And here's the area right here in analyzing and comparing that consistently triggers us. Because as I said, the thalamus shuttles to our memory banks the things that happened before I was abused. And if it sees before I was abused that certain things happened, then I'm going to react to those certain things that happened before I was abused to keep from being abused again. So I'm always triggering because the thalamus is ahead of me, maybe 2 years. So it's analyzing and comparing everything. I mean, everything is compared to what hurt me when I was a child. And then I react for a lifetime. I die in a reactive mode because the thalamus is trying to protect me, making me reactive to things that are not reality and that have nothing to do today with what happened when I was a child. Yet we're reacting childish in those areas. Then when it analyzes and compares, then it catalogs and files it. And that becomes a part of our permanent documentation in our filing cabinet. Now here's what's interesting with this. In this model, if I have never moved to the age of decision, all this is automatic. Now this is going to be automatic from perception to file. That's all automatic. Even as an adult, that's going to happen. Here's where we step in. If I am stuck in the age of directives, hating authority, and I cannot make a decision, then by the comparison, it will retrieve the memory, utilize the adrenaline, and determine and choose itself. The thalamus does this. From retrieval to choosing, the thalamus does it, and we have no control. That's reactive behavior. So if I grow up and mature, then after all this stuff is filed, I retrieve it. I choose to retrieve it. I use what I choose, so I'm in charge of utilizing what's in my memory bank. And if something comes out of my memory bank that's not proper and it's a reactive behavior, I stop it because I determine my future. I determine my path. I choose what I say. Some people say, well, you know, this popped into my head, and you won't let me talk, and you won't let me express myself. Hey, the scripture talks about discipline. We don't need to say everything comes into our head. But when we're triggered, we say things that come into our head that we wish we could suck back when we get our brains back. See, after the adrenaline de-escalates, then we want to say, I'm sorry, and people will say, boy, I wish I was a vacuum cleaner with hair, could suck those words back again and those accusations back again. Well, we're not to say everything that comes to mind. Satan will throw stuff at you out of your wounds to say to somebody, and it just is not to be said. We discipline ourselves. But if I'm arrested in development, I have no discipline, so I just, you know, it's like my mother used to say when I was a kid, diarrhea in the mouth and constipation of the brain. So we need to discipline ourselves and choose the words, because the scripture says we are going to be held accountable for every word we have spoken, let alone accountable for every thought we've ever thought. So when I have thoughts of temptation or Satan throws something across my mind, I rebuke it. I'm done with it. I will not think upon those things. And I'll say it out loud. I'm not going to think upon those things. What am I doing? I'm using my decision-making abilities to retrieve. Even when something triggers, I deal with it. I utilize what I choose to utilize. I determine what I'm going to say and what I'm going to do, and I choose my life. I'm in control of my life. For the first time in all of my life, I started to get control of my life at 40 years of age when I started recovery. And really this process of sanctification. And today I choose what I do. I choose what I say. I don't react. I choose the words I say most of the time. I'm still working on that. I'm not perfect. But it's sure far different than what it used to be. So in this area, from retrieval, utilizing, determines, and chooses, the brain itself will drive us. We're driven by our woundedness. And when we're driven by our wounds, you can rest assured we will never be able to develop relationship. When I bring down the strongholds and I bring captive the imaginations and I realize what I'm dealing with, and I have the right to choose these things, I have the right to dream, I have the right to my goals, I have the right to choose these things, then I'm in control of me, and I don't need to control other people, circumstances, or situations. So in my first marriage with Judy, I was an absolute control freak. I even dressed her. She had no choices in her life. And in this marriage, I never question anything she does. I figure, I won't tell you her age, but she's old enough to be able to make her choices and be who she is and who God wants her to be. And so I don't control her life at all. And in the early years when I would do that, she'd say, well, I don't see it as control, I just want your feedback. But I was such a control freak that I didn't even want to give her feedback because I knew she would take the feedback as control if I did it enough. So she had to grow through that and realize that I trusted her as an adult to be able to make up her own mind and do the things she needed to do for her. So it really smooths out relationships with children, parents, on the job, in the church, the whole thing, by controlling me and not having to control other things. And see, if somebody tries to control me, I will state my case, and then if they keep it up, I take myself out of their ballgame. Because I'm going to do what I'm called to do at any cost, but I do it with gentleness, thinking it through, a plan, never to hurt anybody, but to do what I know I need to do. So this area, as we grow and mature, becomes an area that becomes wonderful as we then are able to choose, bring captive our imaginations, bring down our strongholds, and choose upon what we think. Then we go to the next slide. When I have been hurt in childhood, we have a root cause. We've talked about rejection, incest, molestation, emotional abuse, physical abuse. The early trauma creates an internal perception of powerlessness. So abuse, neglect, domestic violence, poverty, those are some of the other things that can happen. That perception of powerlessness is carried forward from the earliest trauma, and that early trauma can be in the womb and causes PTSD symptoms. And then we move, because of our powerlessness, helplessness, to rage. And rage is nothing more than a cover for painful feelings that we cannot resolve. That's what a rage is. It's nothing more than a cover-up. It's a shield I can hide behind because I'm not able to deal with my stuff. Then we numb out, go into repression, memory loss, no conflict resolution, inability to confront, which then causes an impulse for revenge, creates a cycle of violence, and everything triggers us. We are triggered on everything because we're so powerless that nothing is safe for us. So we're always easily triggered. Then we move to the cycle. And we live, number one, with negative anticipation. Things cannot get better. It's just not going to happen. Forecasting. I know this is going to fail no matter what I do. I don't care what I do. I don't even care if God's in it. It's going to fail. It's not going to work. I'm helpless. I'm hopeless. I feel losses. I feel rejection. I feel like a failure. And I live in that negative anticipation. Then there's an avoidance because of knowing this eventually is going to go south on me. I avoid spouse, family, people, places, issues, and resolution. I just walk away from it. It's easier to run, the way of least resistance. So then we get into power and control. And we're not going to deal with that now, but we've got an abuse wheel, which especially in a marriage relationship, we deal with types of abuse. And not all abuse is physical. It can be intimidation. A woman can tell that she's being intimidated by a look. A man can be the same way. She can look at him and he knows he's in deep trouble. And it's not going to be fun around the ranch for a while. Then what we do is we get into our fantasy life. We kind of massage our brain in a way that we can live with it. So we end up developing false perceptions, irrational beliefs, magical thinking. And boy, that will get us into trouble. And see, again, this is arrested development very early. False perceptions, irrational beliefs, I call it infantile beliefs. And magical thinking is a child. Everything's going to be okay. It's a child. But we live with that knowing the other shoe's going to drop. So then something triggers us and we start to escalate. And then we go back to acts of violence. The power and control is the emotional lead up to the act of violence. And so as we start to escalate, we go into acts of violence. Then what happens is the violence causes, and violence and anger and rage are addictive. There is a payoff to the person who has control. And it's an endorphin payoff. It's not accurate, it's not right, it's pseudo, it's false, but it feels like a payoff. I have control. So what happens in many couples, and we deal with this tremendous amount of time, with various couples that we work with, because what will happen is maybe he's working on his issue and she feels like she's left behind. She's having a depressive day. And he's up here and she's down here. That's how she sees it. It's not true, but that's how she feels. And see, our perceptions are not reality. So what she does then is she'll go push a button on him and keep pushing buttons until he finally freaks out. And then when he freaks out, she justifies in her mind that, well, see, he was up here, but he really isn't where I thought he was, and he's no better than me. So then she uses this to equalize. Now, this is not just all a woman thing. Women have tendencies to use this, but men do too. Because if she goes to counseling and gets help and she starts setting boundaries, he feels abandoned. He looks at it from a different situation. You know, I've seen preachers' wives I've worked with where they would say, well, you know, he's moving so fast and doing so well that maybe he would be better off with another woman in his life that's more compatible to ministry. And so then she makes his life miserable to get them down on an equal level. So it's the teeter-totter balance thing. It's our own self-esteem. It's our wounds of childhood. And so he'll do the same thing. She looks at it as he's ahead of me, so he doesn't need me anymore. See, and so then she creates this chaos and turmoil. And then he may do it to her because she's getting away from him and may abandon him because now she's better and somebody else could be better for her. And so we play this mind game, and then when we finally have the adrenaline has been bled off, then there's what we call the transitory guilt. There's a release of pressure coming down from an adrenaline high, and there's a false accomplishment and a false sense of control. But it's not real and it doesn't satisfy. And it will last at maximum. The transitory guilt lasts at maximum only 72 hours, and then the cycle has to start again. And sometimes it doesn't last 20 minutes. But the reframing then is, as I have gone through this cycle and my transitory guilt moves to shame, then I go into craziness of justifying, looking at irrational belief systems and denial, because I can't believe I did that. That's the bottom line. I just can't believe I did this. So, well, if it hadn't have been for her, you know, if she hadn't, and I would tell Judy this all the time, if you would straighten up, I wouldn't have these problems. I even prayed when I was in ministry and abusing her in the parsonage. You know, God, if you would clean her up and straighten her up and get her attention, I wouldn't have these problems. I have these problems because she's causing me to have these problems. So that's justification. It's an irrational belief system, and we live in denial. And then once I have played my mental games in this cycle, I then go into a honeymoon stage, and I'm a nice guy for a period of time. And then it starts all over again, because as I'm a nice guy, I'm heading back into negative anticipation. So that cycle is really strong. Then we move to a chart that we just developed. And in this chart, we're looking at the top, the original traumatic wound. Rejection, incest, molestation, emotional abuse, physical abuse. That original wound has now activated the amygdala. So it's now working, and it's worked since childhood. And it's still working today because I live in a cycle. And in that cycle, I'm living in anxiety as a normal way of life. In other words, the traumatic wounds of childhood set your idle up a little higher. So instead of idling like a smooth engine, that sucker is revved and ready to pop the transmission into gear or pop the clutch, and we're ready to roll at any given time. So our idle is up there. And that idle being up there causes us to have basically ADD and ADHD. This is one of the roots of ADD and ADHD. It's not the full root, but we're seeing 50 to 60% of ADD and ADHD responding to the Life Skills program, because what we do is make sense of the craziness and we're able to turn the idle down. And when I'm not running on adrenaline, then I retain memory, I can stay focused, I can plan, I can set goals, but as long as I'm living in this cycle of adrenaline, we then end up the trauma raises the tripwire or the idle, creating hyperarousal and intrusive recall. In other words, we're set up with a high idle, the adrenaline rolling, for the trigger or the intrusive memory to come. And in doing that, it creates an adrenaline feed that we live on. Now, adrenaline is like heroin. You start out with heroin, and you need more and more and more and more. And the more you live on adrenaline, the body will adjust itself to the adrenaline flow, and then you need more. So that means I have to create more chaos in my life. And I've had women tell me, not men don't say this, but women will say, you know, the balance of growing up and becoming whole is boring. Sometimes I just want to take a knife and get it in there and get some excitement going, because it helped me coin the term, true love can be very boring. But it's safe, and it's comfortable, and it's trustworthy. See, and that's what we have to readjust. Our adrenaline flows as it comes down and we find our healing. Life becomes non-chaotic. If I was raised in chaos, I'll create chaos in a relationship, just to be able to be in what I was raised in, because I knew how to cope with chaos. So then what happens is we live the next step in numbing, passivity, and very possibly passive-aggressive, withdrawal, denial, and repression. And we live in that circle at the top there. We circle this. When nothing's going on, we live here. We just keep going in a circle. Anxiety, tripwire raises, more adrenaline, less ability to focus, all those kind of things. That's where we normally live. And then something triggers us. And in the trigger, there's a conditioning because of the wounds of childhood, of the trauma response, stimulus, and emotional reactive behavior. So that trigger causes us to react in predictable behaviors. I've worked with people. I had one guy that I worked with that it was interesting to make bets on him. I could take a $20 bet, lay it on the table, because I could say one word and he would freak out, go crazy. I could trigger him in one word. And people would say, oh, no, he's not that predictable. Lay your money down. And I'd say one word and this guy would just freak out, just go crazy. I mean, he'd walk off the job. Just go nuts, because predictability. A couple lives together, they can predict, they know how each other are going to respond. I mean, it's just in the thalamus picks this up. Not only do I know 2 years ahead of time of my wound, the thalamus picks that up, the thalamus picks up the nuances of the partner. And so we can predict each other. Judy can say something to somebody else and say, well, I could get Paul to react. And she could, because she knows me after 45, 47 years of knowing me. I'm pretty predictable. This second time around, it sure changed in predictability after I started my healing and we remarried 21 years ago, especially in the early years of our first marriage. You talk about predictability, it was there. So what happens is we're conditioned to that behavior. Then we go into what's called anticipatory anxiety. Fear of heightened anxiety and arousal, fear of being mentally and emotionally out of control or disorganized, a fear of disorganization. I mean, it becomes a piece of us. I've got to be organized. I have to have everything in place. I have to be perfect. I have to perform. I have to do all these things, or I'm out of control. A fear of reacting abnormally, or creating a scene, or being inappropriate, or being abusive, or always feeling the need to control people, situations, and circumstances. And this really creates depression. Tremendous amounts of depression. Then the avoidance is the next stage of people, places, and things associated with the trauma. So what happens with the couple, sometimes it's, if you don't have the knowledge of what you're dealing with, it's easier to walk away than it is to know it's going to happen again. The way of least resistance. It's easier to walk away. And so that's what I did with Judy. I walked away. I just walked out of her life. I don't know how many times. And finally, permanently. So we avoid people, places, and things associated with trauma, or even the perception of trauma. Going back to the anticipatory anxiety, the perception of trauma. So we try to avoid stress, intimacy, and other people. We try to escape. And this, for a short period of time, provides a false perception of relief and safety. So I can isolate. I'm alone. And I get a little peace of mind. And that feels like safety to me, but it isn't. Because what happens is trying to control the situation, circumstances, and other people, we go into self-doubt and self-criticism, which even increases depression. I should be able to handle this. Only crazy people are this anxious and fearful. Why can't I be normal? I must be crazy. I'm never going to get over it. I'm a hopeless case, flawed and defective, dirty, damaged, and different. I'm a failure as a parent, a partner, a worker. I am a failure. So that sets us up now for more avoidance and more isolation. If I get too stressed, I may lose my mind or my temper. Got to hide. And here's the biggie. I can't let anyone know how scared and weak I feel. And that's where being passive-aggressive comes in. As I feel weak and I've been wimpy and I haven't been able to make a decision and I haven't resolved this conflict. So I am defective. So now I'm going to lash out and I'm going to go aggressive. And then that pushes everybody back and gives you a little more emotional space until we get into the next box. It creates interpersonal and vocational problems. We get into self-abuse. And this is something that I work with a lot with both men and women. We get into self-abuse means that you can get into cutting and piercing and tattooing and a deprivation of sleep and not eating or whatever the case may be, or overeating, anorexia, bulimia. All this can come in at this point. Then the abuse of family, addictions. We use escape mechanisms. We start in our job missing work, so we have employee absenteeism, and it just spirals down. And then what happens is more avoidance and more isolation, trying to get away from all reality, even trying to get away from perceptions. We're trying to avoid everything, which produces more stress at home and at work. We avoid more anxiety, fear of loss, economic anxieties, loneliness, loss of control issues, and many times we allow ourselves to be re-victimized. And for a perpetrator, this is when he will perpetrate again and abuse either himself, his wife, family, whatever. But the aggression comes out, and I have to bleed it off. The adrenaline says that I've got too much and I've got to act out on this. And so the victim gets re-victimized, and sometimes the perpetrator gets victimized, and then the perpetrator starts battering and emotionally abusing and acting out again. And then we lose the adrenaline, go into the honeymoon stage again, and then we go back and live in this circle of the raised tripwire, hyper-arousal, intrusive recall, creating an adrenaline feed, and then we numb, passive-aggressive, withdrawal, denial, and repression. And we stay again in that circle. We never resolve. We never relax. We stay in that circle. It's like running around a corral full speed until the gates open and you can start blowing off the anger and the rage.